The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Cross-border transport between Singapore and Johor Bahru has long been a tricky business. Despite clear rules banning chartered car rides, limousine and private hire operators have continued to shuttle passengers across the border. Vehicles have been impounded, contracts suspended, and enforcement stepped up, but the market hasn't disappeared. At the same time, licensed alternatives are evolving. ComfortDelGro is now offering hotline bookings and doorstep pickups for cross-border taxis, part of broader efforts to modernize the system. But will these legal services actually convince passengers to switch from illegal operators? Are fares and convenience enough to change consumer behavior? And can regulators strike a balance between enforcement and meeting demand? Well, joining us to share more is transport analyst Terence Fan, Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Singapore Management University. Hi, Professor Fan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Professor, what's driving this heightened enforcement against illegal cross-border limousine and private hire services in the first place?
It's a very big question. I believe there's a lot of interest recently in cross-border transport, namely because I think there's some requests for easier access for commuters to cross the border with private hire vehicles. But apparently, private hire vehicles are not allowed to cross the border, and apparently that is not, 100% known in the public. And so that creates a bit of confusion, and I guess that's where some of the interest groups, maybe stakeholders, for example, taxis industry may feel, hey, the fact that this particular form of transport is actually not legal, and maybe one should step up to enforce it, because it's very easy for people to find on the internet companies, and these look like very proper and legitimate companies that actually offer a seamless ride from Singapore to, a point deep inside Johor for people. And I think people understandably, because of the widespread popularity and use of private hire vehicles in Singapore, will naturally say, oh, okay, it's just, the same as what people will do in Singapore. But apparently, when one crosses the border, legality ceases. So I think that's where the authorities say, well, hang on a second, these things have been going on, and maybe that's where, stepped up enforcement kind of is needed.
But really, though, how significant is the safety risk for passengers using illegal cross-border rides that makes it such a contentious topic right now?
Well, we can think of it in two different ways. One is sort of the physical sort of safety. The second is sort of when one kind of falls afoul of regulations. So first is, most of the time, when there are no accidents, then of course, people will not be harmed. But if there are physical accidents, like for example, vehicles get collided into each other, or maybe some other sort of accident where some of the passengers may be in harm's way, then when they try to go and claim for some of the insurance protection, insurance companies may say, well, hang on a second. In the first place, you are in a ride that is not illegal to begin with, and so therefore the insurance policy may not be effective. So if people are hurt or in any way that needs some sort of insurance protection, that may not be around when one meets them. So that's number one. And number two, if one is operating something illegal, then there's always the chance that the authorities may do something about the vehicle. And in this particular instance, we're hearing that vehicles have been impounded. So which means that, the police or some regulatory or enforcing agents may simply stop the vehicle in situ where they are, and then simply say, sorry, you have to get off the vehicle because this is not supposed to be doing what's supposed to. So that means, the passengers and the drivers, in the middle of the journey will be interrupted. So if the passengers are on the way for meeting, sorry, that may not happen on time. So these are some of the inconveniences they can encounter.
I mean, the cross-border taxi scheme has existed for years, but it looks like illegal services still persist. Why do you think such illegal services still persist?
I think one of the reasons is that even though the cross-border service, a taxi service has existed, it has not been very easy for the public to access the taxis. I think people in general knew that, okay, you go to this particular street, somewhere off Queen Street, and then there's a line of taxis and you can, line up and get one to Malaysia. That is well known. But what happens in a lot of people in businesses and also in families and so on is that in this day and age of, the convenience of private hire vehicles is that they kind of expect to be able to dial a number or touch some of the screens and then to have the vehicle magically appear at their doorstep without having to first go to that taxi stand first and then take the vehicles across the border. So I think the people, naturally sort of, say, well, can we do that? And if they do an internet search, one actually finds a lot of companies that look very legitimate that offer these services and with lots of even testimonials of people who have done it. So I think it's kind of difficult to blame the public that, hey, they're not, they're doing something illegal. It's the fact that it looks legal, and then the cross-border taxis until now have not been so easily booked, and it's sort of not easy to even find on the internet. So I think people may genuinely want to do something legally, but it's just that, hey, all these things that popped up turns out to be illegal, and they just happen to have used some of these services, and then they would continue the next time, once they've had a good experience. So I think that's where I think we're kind of in a bit of a slippery slope, and I think it's also time that, hey, if this is not legal, then maybe it should be stopped, right? So I think that's where the enforcement kind of comes in.
Okay.
Right, and also recently we're hearing that at least one taxi company is saying that they're setting up a hotline dedicated for this cross-border taxi service and with very transparent pricing from anywhere in Singapore. So hopefully that also will make that service much better known and therefore will, get the demand that it deserves.
So what does this say about the limitations then of the current cross-border transport system?
Yeah, currently, actually, the Land Transport Authority of Singapore has proposed, and I think they're in the midst of making sure it works, is that in the past, it only works from one location in Singapore off Queen Street to one location in Johor Bahru. And if you want to sort of start from anywhere else in Singapore, you need to sort of take another taxi or private hire vehicle to go to around Queen Street, and then you take that taxi onward. And once across the border, after you alight at that designated alighting point, you will then have to take another, onward connection, which is, a bit circuitous. And the latest proposal from the Land Transport Authority, and I think it's also been enacted by and promoted by at least one taxi company, is that now everyone can call this taxi, the cross-border taxi, from anywhere in Singapore, because the taxi companies in Singapore can already take you anywhere from Singapore to that location in Queen Street. So then why make a detour to Queen Street? You might as well just go from where you are in Singapore, and then the taxi will take you all the way to the alighting point in Johor Bahru. And likewise, because this sort of bilateral things usually goes reciprocally. So likewise, if anyone is taking a taxi, the cross-border, licensed cross-border one, anywhere from JB or anywhere that operates in the Johor state, then it can also come to that one alighting point off Queen Street in Singapore and vice versa. So at least it cuts down on one connection instead of connecting here off Queen Street and then in Johor Bahru. Now you only have to make one connection either way before you go towards your final destination somewhere else. So at least it's a little bit more convenient. And what I believe Land Transport Authority is also working on is now, instead of just having this one designated alighting or departing point in Singapore and Johor Bahru, have multiple ones. So you can not just go from A to B there, you can go from C to D or E to F across in more combinations. So hopefully for more commuters across the border, they don't have to make as many connections. So maybe they can more or less do a direct ride from Singapore to Johor Bahru. More likely to do that at least.
Right. So, how effective do you think the current bilateral approach to clamp down on illegal transport has been so far?
Well, certainly we have seen in the news reports there have been a number of these instances, and I think people in the trade may feel a little bit afraid or a bit scared, and I think that has certain impact because if people in applying the trade are no longer interested or daring to do that, I think that certainly would, or maybe they could just maybe refer the prospective customers to the cross-border taxis, then maybe that will sort of get the taxi companies and the transport authorities to really gauge what this impact or what the travel demand is. Because until now, the only thing they can see is the application for licenses for taxis to be in this cross-border category of taxis that can do this business. And in the Singapore side, at least they can see, hey, we have more quotas than there are taxis applying for it. So the immediate assumption is, well, we have plenty of supply. But that doesn't take into account of the transport demand that has already been absorbed and satisfied by these so-called illegal transport companies in the business. I think that would, give authority a much better sense of how much of a demand there is overall, and then for them to more properly gauge, okay, what would be the sort of the next appropriate things to allow. And of course, this involves two countries, so it takes two to tango. It's a little bit more complicating than one authority setting the rules for everyone. So I think that's something we have to consider as well.
Well, despite enforcement, some limousine companies continue providing cross-border services here. So, how has the recent enforcement affected the livelihoods of drivers who depend on cross-border trips for income? Is this a significant economic blow?
Well, for those who have dedicated their time and resources on plying the trade across the border, they're not licensed taxis, then yes, presumably they may lose all the business. The news reports also suggest, however, some are kind of, continuing to operate this on a sort of a clandestine, basis. And I believe because some actually have contractual obligations that they have signed with companies based in Singapore, even in Johor, who actually ferry some of the employees between the two countries. So I think they're also afraid of actually losing the contact. But I think the proper way is actually for these companies to bring the people to the border and then have the Malaysian counterpart, take over the Malaysian part of the trip. So it actually will involve a transfer vehicle. And because the border here is such that you have the Singapore side and then you have the Malaysian side, so, it's not exactly seamless. And I think that's why there's been a bit of a pent-up demand until today, where people would go for these services because it's just a little bit more convenient from door to door. And we don't currently have this alternative operating allowed, at least, to operate it this way. So I think people may be, or even companies may be a little bit surprised. Now, there are transport companies who are licensed to provide, for example, these yellow buses that go across, or even some of our Singapore-based bus companies are able to go across. So it's like, there are companies who can do that. It's just that they are only allowed to operate on certain routes, and it's not clear, whether that actually, helps all these companies and all these individuals who are traveling from different parts of Singapore to different job. So yes, I think some people's livelihood, are severely impacted. But on the other hand, if they are really interested in applying the trade, maybe go take the taxi license and apply to be a cross-border taxi driver, because apparently there's still, some quotas left, right? So there's one way to think about that.
Well, then, do you think stricter enforcement could unintentionally push some drivers further underground, making it harder to regulate the industry?
That's certainly a possibility. We hear on the news reports already, some drivers will keep applying the trade and take the risk. And I guess their rationale is, enforcement is not going to catch every car, and there's a cost to enforcement. So I think they are going to sort of gamble and sort of take the hit if they do get impounded and so on. So there are, I believe, people who do that, because we know that Singapore is a pragmatic place. It's not going to, spend everything it has just to enforce something. But I think in this case, the authorities may try to make a case, so maybe on that day, maybe they're just could be just doing a lot of enforcement, And so it really depends on when they actually apply that tray again.
Right. Well, for companies whose core contracts involve, shuttling staff between Singapore and Johor, could they realistically pivot to other services without losing clients?
Yes, I believe so, because if they're in the transport company, they probably have access to vehicles, they have access to the drivers, so they certainly can do other things. I mean, we hear, just over the past weekend in the car racing, in Singapore, that a lot of drivers had a bumper few days because of the demand and because of the surge pricing, for example. So certainly there are other opportunities for these drivers, but at the same time, even if they want to continue the trade, they can certainly still apply people from where they're in Singapore right up to the border and maybe organize the Malaysian counterpart to take over from that point onward. So I think that is certainly something that is certainly legal, and that's something if even companies, want to make sure that everything is done properly, that's really the way to do according to the regulations.
Well, ComfortDelGro recently launched hotline bookings and doorstep pickups for cross-border taxis, offering fares from $60 to $120 depending on pickup location. Now, the initiative aims to provide a legal and convenient alternative to illegal limousine services. So, Professor, can ComfortDelGro's new hotline and doorstep pickup service meaningfully shift passengers from illegal operators to licensed taxis?
I think it certainly can, in a meaningful way, shift people. But at the same time, it's not 100% of the solution because, as I mentioned before, ComfortDelGro can pick up people from anywhere in Singapore, but it cannot drop people off anywhere in Johor. So, if you consider the totality of the demand, which is from anywhere in Singapore to anywhere in Johor, that only meets part of it. And that's where I think, people may still try different ways. And for example, I don't know if you think about Johor as a bigger place, then is it possible that people are willing to forego the Singapore leg? They will take it, they'll take a trip back to Queen Street and then have the Malaysian taxi take them further into Johor, for example. So that's still, an alternative that is not quite going to be captured fully by ComfortDelGro.
What about the pricing of this service, though? I mean, at $80 to $120 for most trips, is it competitive enough to compete with illegal operators?
I think it is if you're considering two main segments. One is business people who are really wanting to go, right now. And where the drop-off point in JB is going to be, quite convenient for them. They don't need to make a massive detour elsewhere. And two is if you consider, a family traveling, for example. Normally, yes, they can take a regular bus even to go, across the border. But if they have, the elderly, if they have really young children, if they have bags with them, things get a little bit of a handful. And I think that's where the pricing would kind of ease that physical hassle for them and make sense. But of course, once again, the service right now is limited to, one or, a drop-off point pretty much in Johor Bahru. So, there's still, an extended leg, that people need to consider once they're there. But at least it will reduce some of the hassle on the Singapore side.
Well, how might ComfortDelGro's approach then influence other licensed operators?
Yeah, I think ComfortDelGro is great in coming up with this product in a very transparent pricing. This upfront pricing is sort of the new thing now. I think it really gives commuters or cross-border travelers some comfort in knowing, well, how much is it going to cost? Okay, if it costs this much and this much only, then, people, if they feel like, this is sort of something that they can afford, I think they would gravitate to at least giving it a try and see. And because there is now this increased risk in vehicles being impounded, which means that your journey over there via other means may be interrupted some way. And in the middle of the road, you kind of have to figure out what to do with your bags and with your children and so on and to find a way across. So I think people are more aware of these now and may at least give it a try. But again, it depends on, the peak travel periods, for example, year-end holidays or maybe Chinese New Year. And I think that's where we'll see whether this really has enough capacity for the traveling demand. And that's where I think some of these other ride services will also try to sort of test out if they can kind of maintain the service without getting caught.
Well, I mean, authorities are exploring improvements as well to the cross-border taxi service, including expanding pickup points, increasing the quota for licensed taxis, and enabling app-based bookings. Now, Malaysia has also expressed willingness to introduce cross-border ride-hailing services in collaboration with Singapore. So, Professor, before we let you go here, what measures would have the most immediate impact in reducing illegal operations, and what challenges do you foresee in implementing this initiative?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that's something that our Land Transport Authority people are working on very feverishly. Well, definitely, I think allowing more travel flexibility between the two countries is a major start. As you mentioned, Hongbin, the Land Transport Authority, and also the Malaysian counterpart are probably considering to set up more pick-up and drop-off points, and I think that's definitely a big first step. Second would be sort of, continuing to ease the way through which people can, book for these taxis, because people now, they don't just want to call and know that the taxi is coming. They want to be able to check on their phones and see where the vehicle, are they close by, are they turning on, around the corner. I think there's a lot of anxiety, during peak period travel that people really have on these services. And I hope as this liberalization further takes place, people not only feel the travel convenience, so they can go from wherever they are to closer to at least wherever they want to go, plus that will, whatever they can do here in a booking process will ease some of the anxiety in knowing, okay, the vehicle is there, it's just around the corner, it's not somewhere else. So I think that, in this day and age, is going to help people with this. Of course, then it comes the question of what if people book and cancel? Okay, then we kind of have to get into the nitty-gritty in the operations of specific companies. But I think at some point, people will kind of have these expectations. So I think having these in the consideration and talking to the Malaysian counterpart, I think will be useful. But again, as I said, this is something that involves two countries. Is not so simple as what we want, is sort of what we want and what we can get out of the other side. There's a little bit of a give and take we have to keep in mind.
Definitely. Well, some great insights from you here. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was transport analyst Terence Fan, assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the Singapore Management University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
Money FM 89.3